Thank you very much. Today we're launching an important book which looks at South Africa and Nigeria. Both countries account for about 40% of the economy of Africa, and both have also engaged in peacemaking in places like Liberia and Sierra Leone, as well as the DRC and Burundi. And so these are two of the most indispensable powers, as I call them, on the African continent. And I think without these two countries working together, Africa is not really going to be able to experience a renaissance. So we have two of the authors, both the editor and the author in the book, and I'm going to let Dr. Bam actually do the introduction of them. But I do want to say that these represent two of the brightest up-and-coming scholars of the next generation that we have. So I'm particularly excited to be listening to them. As I noted, we're commemorating Africa Day today. We're expecting the Nigerian High Commissioner to South Africa, as well as the Consul General, and also the Portuguese ambassador here in South Africa. I don't think they're here already, but I just wanted to say, as we say in Abuja, all protocol observed, in case they do walk in. I have to just introduce Dr. Bam, and then I'm going to sit down, and my own role is more or less finished till maybe the end of proceedings. Dr. Bam is well known to everybody, I'm sure. She studied at Shawbury Methodist Institute and Lovedale Teachers College in South Africa, and then went on to the University of Chicago, one of the most prominent of the Ivy League universities, obtained a master's there. She studied social work. She also trained in education, and her career and work have straddled various responsibilities. She's been a teacher, a social worker, a feminist, a gender justice advocate, an economist, and a Democrat who has played a central role in the reimagination of the transition in South Africa, and I'll talk a bit more about that in a bit. As a feminist and advocate of justice, Dr. Bam worked in the 1980s for the Women's Workers Program in Geneva, the Africa division. She later took on executive and leadership positions in a variety of different organizations. International ecumenical organizations such as the World Council of Churches and the World Young Women's Association. In 1988, she was elected as the Secretary General of the South African Council of Churches, a position she held until 1997, when she became a commissioner with the Independent Electoral Commissioner. A Pan-Africanist to the core, she also joined the Ghanaian feminist theologian and New Testament scholar. Dr. Bam has demonstrated a commitment to the broad development of South Africa and the continent through her varied interests in women's empowerment, and demonstrated by her participation as one of the founding members of the Women's Development Foundation, which in 1998 she became the president of. She went on to become the chairperson of the Independent Electoral Commission of South Africa, laying the foundation that we've seen now in its sixth election, right? She has also taken leadership through participation of numerous boards in higher education, civil society, and ecumenical movements. These have included the Malta Trust, the SABC, the Thabo Mbeki Foundation, the TISO Foundation, Vodacom, and she was also a member of the eminent panel of the wise of the African Union, and is a friend of the panel accompanying it. She served as the Chancellor of Nelson Mandela Metropolitan University, as well as Walter Sisulu University, and she's been a recipient of numerous honorary doctorates from UNISA, from Kaput, Cape Peninsula, from Fort Hare, from Wits University. and she has several prestigious awards, including the National Order of the Baobab, for the role that she played in the upliftment of women and her contributions to democracy in South Africa. She also received the Mahatma Gandhi and Simon of Syrian Award. Although she's retired now, Dr. Bam is still one of the foremost South African women social activists and leaders, and still continues to contribute to both national and continental issues. So we could not have a better chair just after South Africa has had elections and Nigeria had elections a couple of months ago. So I want you to give a very warm round of applause to Dr. Bam, and we should recognize her contribution. So, and if the speakers could also come up, I hand over now to Dr. Bam to take us through the evening.
Thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you very much for your welcome. I think actually it's a privilege, I think, for many of us who are here, that we are able to participate in the thinking and the honor of listening to these young scholars on my left and right. I think today I'm a very, very proud mother and grandmother, in fact, as I look at the two speakers, and I think there is hope for the continent. I'm really feeling pleased that we have these scholars in this continent who really are the thinkers for the future. And they're the people whom I believe, because they are there scholars, are going to be able to put the continent in a special place in the world, because we are part of the global world. And being part of the global world, we don't simply want to be listening to other people. It's wonderful that we have them, the two of them. I will start with Dr. Teller on my left. And I will read very quickly, because I think it will be of interest to you to know who he is. Fortunately, when these introductions are made, people don't tell the age. Thanks goodness. Dr. Teller, you will just is a senior researcher at this institute, which we have just been introduced to. So he's part of this university team. He holds a doctorate in political science from the University of KwaZulu-Natal in South Africa, and was a postdoctoral fellow at the University of South Africa in UNISA in Tshwane in 2016 and 2017. He has edited the book we are launching today, entitled Nigeria-South Africa Relations and a Regional Hegemonic Competence. I must say, I did look up today the word hegemonic in French to be absolutely sure that, and they have exactly the same word for those of you. It's that in French it says N-I-E, but the meaning is the same. It means something else exotic. Those of you who will look up and that is the book she has. And she also has contributed in a number of articles in a number of journals, such as Politicon, Journal of Asian and African Studies, and Journal of Black Studies. His research interests include foreign policy, international relations, soft power, peace and conflict, and African politics. So he really is in the heart of those issues that are a challenge to our continent. Maybe I should introduce you later. I think I prefer to do that, because I would like that we all pay our attention to the book. Just before he speaks, I have not been asked to promote the book. I have had a privilege of reading most of it. It's very colorful, and typical university books, you know, they have hardcover, very beautiful book. I want you all to see it. And I have no idea how much the book is going to cost. You know, people don't say those things. But it's an amazing book, and I would hope that when we buy it here, I'm looking towards your direction, sir, it will have a discount, because it's worth reading. Even though we think we know these countries, these two wonderful countries, it's a wonderful book, but we'll talk about that later. Okay, now we should give you a chance to present to us your thoughts, as you please.
Thank you, Chair, for your kind words of introduction. Your Excellencies, I hope they're here, the Nigerian Ambassador and Consulate General in South Africa, Your Excellency, the Portuguese Ambassador to South Africa, distinguished guests, good evening. There is no gainsaying that Nigeria-South Africa relations are not only critical to these regional powers, but the entire continent. It is not therefore surprising that Adebayo describes the relations as Africa's most indispensable. Landsberg dubs the relations as a case of volatility and tension. Sheteolu labels the relations as omnium gantarum of good and evil. I label the relations as a roller coaster ride. Irrespective of how we discuss or how we label South Africa-Nigeria relations, one thing it's important, which is the fact that Nigeria and South Africa are arguably the most important states on the continent. I have divided my presentation into 4 parts. The first part provides a historical overview of Nigeria-South Africa relations. The second part presents the major arguments of my chapter and outlines the structure of the book. The last section x-rays post-elections relations. Indeed, Nigeria-South Africa relations are pivotal to peace, sustainable development, Pan-Africanism, and regional integration in Africa. However, relations between these two countries have been marked by constant oscillation. During the apartheid era, relations were at their lowest ebb as Nigeria's foreign policy of fighting colonialism and eradicating white minority rule across Africa was in constant and was in direct conflict with successive apartheid administrations' interest. Nigeria provided leadership as the chair of the United Nations Committee Against Apartheid for over 20 years. Nigeria was also at the forefront of the cause for South Africa to be expelled from the Commonwealth in 1961. And Nigeria was also one of the pathfinders in the call for South Africa to be expelled and to be banned from participating in international sporting events, including the 1972 and 1976 Olympic events in Munich and Montreal. Nigeria also provided education and safe haven for South African students and political exiles, including Thabo Mbeki, who was in Nigeria between 1976 and 1978. In 1976, Nigeria established the Southern African Relief Fund. The donation of 100 naira by a woman who was moved by the graphic symbolism of the evils of apartheid provided the seed money that ignited nationwide donation for this fund. While it's debatable the exact amount Nigeria spent on its fight against apartheid, some estimate the figure to be around tens of billions of US dollars. The dawn of democracy in 1994 promised cordial relations between South Africa and the rest of the continent. However, relations between Nigeria and South Africa soared because the Nigerian because, because Nelson Mandela could not turn a blind eye on human rights abuse by the then military dictatorship of General Sani Abacha. Mandela's call for economic sanctions and diplomatic isolation, including Nigeria's expulsion from the Commonwealth, seems to have fallen on deaf ears, as other African countries could not imagine having a hostile relation with a country that has contributed in terms of African development and unity, while South Africa was in the doldrums of apartheid. Poor relations in this era resulted in the Nigerian male football team not being able to participate in the 1996 African Cup of Nations, hosted and won by South Africa. I guess South Africa was able to win that tournament because Nigeria did not participate. The Mandela, the Mbeki Obasanjo era was a sharp contrast to the preceding administrations. Both individuals became the president of their countries in 1999, and they established a very solid relationship, evident in the signing of the Binational Commission in 1999, efforts towards peacemaking, peacekeeping, and Pan-Africanism across the continent, and the transition of OAU to AU, and the establishment of NEPAD and APRM. The end of Mbeki and Obasanjo's administration reversed Nigeria-South Africa relations. While there have been positive signs, such as the relaunch of the Binational Commission in 2016, and the fact that South Africa has over 120 multinational companies operating in Nigeria. However, these positive signs have been overshadowed by competition and rivalry, such as the quest for a permanent seat at the United Nations Security Council, the fiasco leading to the election of Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma as the AU Commission chairperson. This is complicated by the Nigerian government imposing $5.2 billion on MTN. The collapse of synagogue in 2014 that resulted in the death of more than 80 South Africans. The criminal activities of some Nigerians in South Africa, particularly drug dealing and an internet scam. The extrajudicial killings of Nigerians at the hands of South African police. And all these have actually overshadowed the good relations between these countries. This book is structured around 4 chapters and 11 sections. I beg your pardon, 4 sections and 11 chapters. The first section speaks to Nigeria-South Africa relation within the context of the sources, the limits, and critique of their regional powerhood. This section has 3 chapters. The first chapter, which I authored, engages the challenges to Nigeria's capacity and South Africa's capacity to act as effective hegemons on the continent. The second chapter, authored by Dr. Jasbai, offers a decolonial critique of Nigeria and South Africa's role in international affairs. The third chapter assesses Nigeria and South Africa's credibility and eligibility in their quest to become a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council. The second section of this book assesses Nigeria's South Africa role particularly in terms of combating the dark side of globalization. This section has four chapters that basically engage Nigeria-South Africa relations in terms of climate change, xenophobia, and drug trafficking. Section 3 of this book has 2 chapters. Both chapters engage Nigeria-South Africa relations in the context of their role in regional integration, particularly in their sub-regions and also on the continent. The last section of this book offers a comparative analysis of Nigeria and South Africa in the areas of transitional justice and civil society. In my chapter, I engage the capacity of Nigeria and South Africa to have as effective hegemon on the continent. Arguably, Nigeria and South Africa, as I mentioned earlier, are absolutely powerful. And this is seen in what we describe as coercive or hard power and attractive and soft power. In terms of their coercive power, Nigeria and South Africa are the largest economies in Africa, with GDPs of $397 billion and $349 billion in 2018. And these countries are also regarded as the most important peacemakers on the continent, evident in Nigeria's peacekeeping roles in Sierra Leone and Liberia, and South Africa's in Burundi and DRC. In terms of their soft power, Nigeria's power of attraction is derived from its entertainment industry and its foreign policy. Given Nigerian movies and music popularity across the continent, I can argue that African entertainment wears a Made in Nigeria label. In terms of South Africa's soft power, this is derived from its liberal constitution, which is regarded as one of the most progressive in the world, the larger-than-life personality of late Nelson Mandela, its progressive and reputable universities, such as the University of Johannesburg, and its multinational corporations. I think it's important to note here that MTN has 56.6 million, 65.6 million subscribers in Nigeria, definitely more than South Africa's population.
Yeah, yes, indeed.
Yeah. However, it must be said that these countries' ability to have as effective hegemons in Africa are being constrained on many levels. There are internal, regional, and international constraints. The internal constraints include political corruption, high levels of poverty, inequality, and unemployment. Ethnicity, racism are also important constraints. The regional constraints include envy and non-acceptance of Nigeria and South Africa's leadership by other African countries. And the external constraints highlight the influence of great powers, such as the United States, China, and France. The influence of these countries undermine the influence of Nigeria and South Africa within the continent. Thus, it is important for Nigeria and South Africa to be able to address these constraints to effectively have the role of a hegemon in Africa. In the post-election period, President Cyril Ramaphosa and his counterpart in Nigeria need to work closely together to ensure peace, sustainable development, Pan-Africanism, and regional integration in Africa. And I must say that there has been an important positive sign, which is the fact that MTN is now listed on the Nigeria Stock Exchange. However, it remains to be seen if President Ramaphosa and his counterpart, Muhammadu Buhari, would be able to take Nigeria-South Africa relation back to its glory days. In conclusion, Chair, I would like to conclude with the words of President Cyril Ramaphosa. Like it or not, Nigeria and South Africa are joined together at the hip. I thank you.
Thank you very much. I do want to add something that you forgot. He also has a section on gender. And I think the women will be delighted to hear that because it's something that is very important in this continent. And he has written an excellent, excellent section on that. So I think that the women will make sure they read that section very much. I listened to this comparison of these two countries, but I just want to make a comment on a personal experience for me. When I met Nigerians many years ago, one of the things they did for me coming from South Africa at the time of apartheid, when some of us had not being aware that we'd internalized this inferiority, you know. And then you meet Nigerians, and I think one of the strongest things they did to many of us is this feeling of people who are proud of who they are. The identity, affirmation of culture, not apologetic about things they are. And for me, that was the greatest admiration. But the second one was that I was living in Geneva. And those of you who know Switzerland, that, you know, it's a country that's very neutral, very much on its own. And this famous Nigerian cardiologist enters this city of Geneva. And those of you who know that, you know, it's an important city internationally. And he was the first cardiologist to do a heart operation after it had been done in South Africa. You know, I was so proud to be an African that every corner I turned, I just wanted people to notice me because his name was in the papers. And the story is told that when he came to the theater, those of you who are familiar with the operations of a theater, he made an apology to other surgeons that his French is not very good. And he said, I'm not even sure of my English. And he went on to say, anyway, I don't think we'll need the two languages at this point. This kind of confidence, it's just very, very important. But one story which I cannot resist to tell before you think of the difficult questions you want to ask has to do with our elections of these two countries. Nigeria, South Africa were always embarrassed because South Africa, we have a population of 50 million. I won't say anything about the population of Nigeria. And then they had a crisis, a famous crisis in the world of elections. They had to ban millions and millions and millions. I won't tell you the figures because you'll think I exaggerate, of their ballot papers because there had been a disagreement in court. And so the Nigerians thought South Africans were clever enough, maybe were their partners, will be able to print millions and millions and millions of ballot papers for Nigeria, which South Africa tried. Oh, didn't we try to live up to the expectations? Because they didn't want the printing to be done in Nigeria. They've got more printers than us in South Africa. And so this fleet of planes arrives in Nigeria. They are coming to pick up, really, it's a story. And I was already in Nigeria to observe their elections. They came to pick up their millions and millions, and the big story told that, President Thabo Mbeki, being a greatest friend of President Obasanjo those days, cleared the air for them. And this amazing, they are the only ones in the world ever known to do that, that they could fly and get those ballot papers by morning to Nigeria. Those of us who are in the field of elections, that's a miracle. You should do that story in your book, because it's one of the best stories, yeah. Anyway, I hope that people have jotted notes. I hope you have jotted notes of the comments and questions you wish to make. But for now, I will invite the other speaker so that then we can raise the questions and comments from the two speakers at the same time. Permit me to do so. Our second speaker, who is sitting on my right, is Dr. Ahmed Jazbai. He is a senior lecturer at the University of South Africa, UNISA, in Tshwane, not Pretoria. He holds a doctorate in political science from the University of Johannesburg. So he is also a product of this university. His doctoral thesis is entitled Civil Religion in South Africa, Mandela through the lens of Machiavelli and Rousseau. Those of you who are scholars will not only pronounce it correctly, but you will understand what it means. His most recent book chapter in the book we are launching today was A Decolonial Critique of Nigeria and South Africa's Economic and Political Leverage in the Global System. Dr. Jazbai's research interests include political theory, decoloniality. It was the first time I heard that word, decoloniality, and that's wonderful. I liked it very much. I used it so I could sound a little intellectual. Hegemony and Nigeria-South Africa relations. This is probably one of the long chapters, and I will say to people, buy this book, because it's something that makes you feel you want to be young again, which is too late for us, but I'm glad a young scholar is tackling this. We invite you to speak.
Thank you, Chair Dr. Baum. Invited guests, academics, students, all protocol observed. I want to begin by providing a brief background to the thought process that started this chapter. As was mentioned, Dr. Teller was a postdoctoral fellow and a colleague of mine in my department not too long ago. And it emerged, I think it was around 2016, 2017, that Nigeria had regained its position as the foremost economy in Africa, overtaking South Africa once again. And we would have a friendly conversation around this. But it got me thinking with Dr. Teller, what is the purpose of this status as as Africa's foremost economy? Does it hold any purpose? Does it hold any leverage? What do Africans gain out of this as a whole? Are we better individually as Nigerians and South Africans, or as Chris Landsberg puts it, if Nigeria and South Africa act in concert, Africa is better. So what was the point of all of this? Both countries are, I begin my chapter, by situating and contextualizing Nigeria-South Africa relations. Both countries are undoubtedly political, economic, and military leaders in their respective sub-regions. Although South Africa tends to have the edge, if I can put it that way, in terms of soft power projection on the global stage, within the African Union, BRICS, G20, and so on and so forth. However, as I said, as Dr. Taylor has stated on many occasions, Apologies for that. You know, as Dr. Taylor, he goes into much of the detail regarding, you know, these political, economic, and military strengths of Nigeria and South Africa. Although I, in some way, reproduce that in my chapter, I take a different look. You know, I argue that the hegemonic statuses of South Africa and Nigeria within West Africa and within SADC has never been, in my opinion, about attaining equity in the conduct of international relations, nor to champion the interests of less developed African countries, be it in their sub-regions or within Africa at large. You know, I argue that both Nigeria and South Africa, and perhaps South Africa in particular, use the de facto legitimacy that has been afforded to them to advance their own national interests, and not Africa's interests at large. I mean, as Dr. Taylor spoke about the quest for a permanent seat in the United Nations Security Council, if and when that ever materializes, we can see in its current form, both Nigeria and South Africa are not working together for the two permanent seats. They are perhaps, you know, worried about their own national interests. And that is unfortunate, because the future of Africa, it does not lie within, you know, Nigeria and South Africa relations independently, but rather within Nigeria and South Africa working together to advance the Pan-African agenda. So I use a decolonial epistemic perspective in this chapter. Dr. Baum said she first heard the word decoloniality after reading my chapter. Yes. Just a brief background. Decoloniality is different from decolonization. The decolonial process started in 1945, but decoloniality argues that there are still systemic structures from colonialism that continue to linger after the formal end of colonialism. So we are still living, as I argue, in a colonial world. The modern world system is still premised upon the agendas of the global north. As you know, Walter Magnolo, in his book, The Dark Side, Dr. Taylor, you spoke about dark side of globalization. He talks about the dark side of Western modernity. And he says, you know, to quote him, that the decolonization process was planned, dictated, and executed from Europe. So, and Africa has struggled to find its place in the various global epochs, you know, be it 1648 Westphalian epoch or the post-1945 epoch. And the most glaring shortcomings of both Nigeria and South Africa and African states in general is that they try to promote inclusive development while still maintaining its outlook as a colonized state, which I argue is a contradiction in terms. And the competitive relationship between Nigeria and South Africa preserves this dark side of Western modernity because it preserves this underdevelopment of Africa. South Africa has vast inequalities. Nigeria has vast inequalities. You know, the relationship between South Africa and Nigeria cannot be independent. That the bilateral relation must take a Pan-African agenda and take the rest of Africa with it. And that is fundamental to the future of Africa. This decolonial solution, as I like to call it, does not necessitate abandoning national interests, but rather advancing Pan-African agendas within the modern world system. You know, without resolving multiple contradictions of growth and development at home, you know, it's unlikely that South Africa and Nigeria can advance Africa's interests. So whilst we push
those
forward
women
this
who were
Pan-African
taken
agenda,
from a school.
South Africa and Nigeria, although
you
most
call them?
ideally suited to advance the Pan-African agenda,
Alright.
need to solve internal contradictions, internal development contradictions, which our presidents have spoken about on various podiums. Unfortunately, the current Pan-African debate seems to be hamstrung. The leaders of the Pan-African debate in 21st century, our former presidents, Mbeki, Obasanjo, Abdoulaye Wade of Senegal, as well as the late Pan-African revolutionary, Muammar Gaddafi, have left us without a champion, without a leader to champion the cause of Pan-Africanism on the continent. And therefore, going forward, South Africa and Nigeria need to further this agenda of economic emancipation on the continent and move beyond what Savella and Lovgasheni refers to as the myth of decolonization in the 21st century. Because as I said, decoloniality argues that whilst we may have loosened the political or structural shackles of colonization, we still are faced with states that are colonial in outlook and which unfortunately still depend upon the former colonial masters in the global north. And I outlined 6 ways in which both South Africa and Nigeria can be guided by the Pan-African agenda if they're going to advance the African interest in the 21st century. Firstly, I argue that universities, for example, such as the Institute for Pan-African Thought, can play a crucial role in this regard. Universities, think tanks, and government and civil society organizations need to conduct comprehensive research in drawing up a cooperation agreement. The framework as to how we should approach Pan-Africanism in the 21st century. Secondly, the private sectors of both countries must cooperate on available business opportunities. Whilst we see a plethora of South African companies in Nigeria, it is less, conversely, the less is not the same. So we need to see more Nigerian companies and more Nigerian exports. Dr. Taylor, you spoke about Nollywood. I'm ashamed to say I haven't watched a single Nollywood production, be it video, be it music, or anything for that matter. Third, our media needs to be constructive in highlighting historical, cultural, and social ties that bind our countries. Whilst I'm not positing or arguing that we should whitewash the severe shortcomings that Dr. Taylor speaks about and I do speak about in my book, but rather to focus on the ties that bind us so that we can move forward in the 21st century. Fourth, South Africa is a partner in BRICS, although a rather minor partner at that. I mean, we can more be regarded as a briquette than a real brick, given that our economy is about 5 times smaller than the next smallest economy within BRICS. But my point is that South Africa should lobby fellow BRICS countries for the inclusion of Nigeria within this arrangement, because a South Africa-Nigeria relationship would stand a stronger chance of decolonizing the power bloc within BRICS and projecting African interests in the modern world system. I argue that BRICS, although is really trumped as a decolonizing agenda, is anything but a decolonizing agenda. At best, it has achieved de-Westernization. BRICS still is premised on a colonial structure, and this I argue in my chapter. In the fifth way, I'm not sure how much time I have. I think
please go ahead. Yeah,
I still do have enough time.
No,
okay.
I'm fine.
Although South Africa and Nigeria possess large and advanced militaries, both countries need to explore ways in which their military might, for example, on an ad hoc basis, take the lead in the African standby force when it intervenes in African hotspots, in conflict hotspots on the continent. We've seen how vulnerable Africa is. During the 2011 impasse in Libya, Western nations, and ashamedly South Africa, voted in favor of this resolution. Western nations used the pretext of a no-fly zone to effect regime change in Libya. Let us be unapologetic about that and not mince a word. It was regime change, nothing other. Libya, 8 years later, is a failed state trading in black African slaves. There are 2 or 3 rival governments that operate within Libya, and a warlord, which is backed by Arab dictators, is now pressing ahead to try to take over Tripoli. So with an effective African standby force, and South Africa and Nigeria can be the first to intervene in these hotspots, to prevent the global north from advancing their own nefarious agendas. And finally, both countries need to aspire towards being models of democratic governance on the continent. Nigeria this year celebrates 20 years of unbroken democratic rule, and in 2015 experienced its first peaceful changeover of government. South Africa has now experienced 25 years, although not fraught with its inconsistencies and difficulties. President Buhari was re-elected in February this year, if I'm not mistaken. However, in terms of in terms of voter turnout in Nigeria, it has been rather poor. It's been at 35% in 2019, down from 44% when President Buhari was first elected in 2019. South Africa has come down from 73% to about 65.5%, give or take. And such declines demonstrate a waning interest by the South African and Nigerian populace in protecting, in my opinion, democracy on the continent and within their respective states and on the continent. So South Africa and Nigeria need to solve this issue of democracy, solidify democracy. We see that the fight back appears to be underway in 2019 under Ramaphosa administration in South Africa. You know, the state capture inquiry, the various other inquiries, be it the inquiry on the NPA, the Public Investment Corporation. The fight back seems to be underway, but there appears to be a lot of resistance. And this needs to be solidified within the next 5 years, and 4 years in the case of Nigeria. And once we solve or solidify democracy within our own backyards, Chair, we need to reignite the African peer review mechanism. It's been dormant of late, and there appears to be a lot of resistance in really entrenching the principles of the APRM: good governance, democracy, transparency, and accountability. However, and if I may end with a warning, you know, the quest for African futures is fraught with difficulty and sacrifices. African revolutionaries from Thomas Sankara, Samora Machel, Patrice Lumumba, Kwame Nkrumah, and lately Muammar Gaddafi attempted to de-link from the modern world system and put African interests above that of their former colonizers, but they lost their fragile grip to power through assassinations, CIA-sponsored coups, and so on. So the road to Pan-African futures in the 21st century is difficult. And I end with that. Thank you very much.
I hope you'll buy the book, because a lot of things that he has said are in chapter 2 of the book. So in case you want to read more on those things.
Firstly, I would like to greet everybody in the African spirit. It's unfortunately you say no comments, but I thought maybe you'll bring African food, Nigerian food versus South African food first, so that we can discuss further in terms of the hegemony of Dr. Tele. But my question is on to you, Dr. Tele, about what the aspirations of my CIC, Comrade Malema, about opening the boundaries in Africa and also actually contributing towards the emancipation of Africa, not only economically, but also socially. Thank you very much.
While the panelists were giving their speech, I was always having at the back of my mind, if you want to play at the international stage, then you must be big. Big in population, big in economies, big. Either you go big or you go home. Now we say Nigeria and South Africa are hegemons of Africa. But when you combine these two countries on many statistics, GDP, we're less than 1 trillion.
Yeah.
Population, we're less than 300 million, even if Nigeria is 200. Inequality, we're still, how then
Education.
what actionable steps can we take, moving us away from this zero-sum game of competition where South Africa wins and Nigeria loses, or Nigeria wins and South Africa loses, in whatever forum. For example, even if you want to take business, it's easy to open business in Nigeria. It's very hard to open a Nigerian business in South Africa. It's just that yin-yang.
So I missed a lot of the talk, but with what I got some context on where this is happening. And the question I had was, what exactly is the African agenda? Because we were speaking about it with no specific agenda, what it is. And it's very difficult to put this in a more realistic context when you don't know what exactly we're talking about. So, especially when you mentioned that South Africa and Nigeria should be more open into having affiliations with other African countries, and I want to know in what context does that happen, especially because different countries have different issues that they prioritize. So when you open that conversations to other African countries, is it liable or viable? Because the issues are not going to be necessarily the same. So I want to know what exactly it is that we...
Thank you very much, Chairperson. I just want to ask a question about the African states. You know, if we ask ourselves, what is the meaning of the modern states as we have them today in Africa? What is its essence and purpose? If we apply those questions to the African state, we'll find that the African state does not satisfy the definition of a state in terms of its purpose and essence. So one of the...
It's a tough one.
Okay, I don't want to talk too much, but the point is, isn't it time in Africa that we begin to ask ourselves the tough questions of whether the things we call states today, artificial as they say they are, actually satisfy the essence and purpose they're supposed to be serving? And if not, is it possible to rethink them, redefine them, so that the whole idea of Pan-Africanism and the African Union can derive new meanings from a redefined African state?
There was a question on Malema, Malema's views on regional integration. And there was another question on African integration by someone there, the significance of African integration. I think both questions are linked, so I would like to answer
I think so.
both questions at the same time. I think regional integration is absolutely important. And even though we have struggled in that regard, you will recall that the presidencies of Mbeki and Obasanjo did well in terms of regional integration, evident in the establishment of APRM, NIPAD, and the transition of OAU to AU. But the bottom line here is that our current leaders are not serious about regional integration. That has to be said. And for us to actually integrate, I think the initiative has to come from the civil society organizations, because it is clear that our different leaders across Africa are only concerned about the national interest of their various countries. So there is a need on the part of civil society actors, academics, to be able to champion regional integration on the continent rather than leaving this to African leaders to pursue, because it seems to me that they are not serious about regional integration. African leaders are basically sovereignty hawks. They just want to maintain national sovereignty and pursue their national economic interests rather than the African interest. Yeah, also on regional integration, I think it's important that for us to be able to have a viable regional integration across the continent, we have to start from the sub-regions. What has SADC done in terms of regional integration? Yeah. What has ECOWAS done in terms of regional integration? COMESA, EAC. Because if we are unable to integrate at these sub-regional levels, I think it will be difficult to integrate at the continental level, because I belong to the school of thought of a gradualist process. And I think that has always been one of the key components of Nigerian foreign policy since independence. We believe in a gradualist approach to regional integration. So regional integration for me has to start from the sub-regions, and then it can escalate to the continental level. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. There was a question on, this zero-sum game. I think that's the phrase that was used. And that's precisely what I do in my chapter, is to argue that for Africa to move forward, Nigeria and South Africa have to work in concert. Whilst, South Africa's economy seems to be still waning, recently Egypt overtook South Africa as the second largest economy. Realistically, it is still South Africa and Nigeria that still have that credibility to move South Africa forward in the 21st century. And however, there are a number of issues that block the realization of this goal. And primarily it's the problem of realpolitik. States in Africa, and that's another point we'll come to later in my response, appear to be more closer to their colonial masters, if I can put it that way. And in West Africa, partly to Britain, partly to France. And South Africa and Nigeria are unfortunately unable to move away from this problem, from this stumbling block. And that's why I argue that we've got to come together collectively. Combined, we might be less than $1 trillion in GDP, but it's the best hope going forward to advance the African agenda, that we are able to overcome the issues of realpolitik, overcome adherence to the former colonial masters, and put the African agenda first. But unfortunately, as Dr. Taylor said, we are lacking in leadership and in the present era to champion this cause going forward. And I just want to come to a point on, the state in Africa versus the African state. what do we have in the modern era? The modern era, what we have is a state in Africa, not an African state. And we need a fundamental reconfiguration of the state in Africa into the African state, because we are still premised on, the Westphalian order. We are still premised on the curse of Berlin, as Professor Adebayo speaks of. So these are fundamental issues that need to be dealt with going forward. That we need to really understand that states in Africa need to be more in line with an African state, as opposed to resemble a colonial state or a colonial Western orientated state.
Thank you very much. I think for these kinds of discussions, we really need more than an hour. We need more than 40 minutes. These are very serious issues for the continent. And we need to go in depth. And I think, the Institute probably is the best that you have been able to create that space for us. But we need more time since you have created the space. And I think that one of the things I want to make as a comment is how do we, in our process of the recreation of the continent, how do we utilize more than we seem to do the intellectuals and scholars and researchers? I do not see clearly when we talk of democracy and governance and elections and our campaigns and everything else, something somehow is missing. And I would like to say, is there a way in which perhaps as a continent we begin not only to recreate a state, but to recreate how do we utilize for this continent the scholars, the research that we have? Because most of our governments, I do not claim to know all the governments in the continent, but through elections I have traveled in many parts of this continent. I don't think that we are really, as governments, taking enough of the people and the research that is around us. And maybe other governments do make use of the research and they try to engage. And I want to say thank you to you young scholars. You are the hope of the continent. And keep talking and keep talking and keep writing. And maybe everybody one day will be able to hear what you say. And thank you, everybody. Thank you for listening. Thank you for being such a wonderful audience.